time to get started. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. This is the session on language acquisition 5, focusing on the role of phonetics. My name is Holman C, and I'll be chairing this session. So our first speaker today, or actually is going to be Jian Lee and Han Young Park, both from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And their talk is entitled, "Is Strong Inhibitory Control Always Better in Learning Non-Native Phonological Contrasts?" So Jian, go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you see my screen well?
Yes.
Okay. Hello everyone. Today I will give you a presentation titled "It's Strong Inhibitory Control Always Better in Learning Non-Native Phonological Contrast." When second language learner given to a second language training is given to learners, their achievements are not identical. Some learners achieve high level of learning, but other learners sometimes do not learn much. To understand this wide range of variations in L2 learning, research on finding out the sources of variations are important. One possible source of individual differences is underlying learners' executive function. Executive function refers to a set of general purpose control processes that regulates one's thoughts and behaviors. Previous studies have provided some evidence of a potential link between individual differences in executive function and speech perception processes. Among three core executive functions, which have been extensively tested, we focused on inhibitory control in the current study. Inhibitory control is a crucial mechanism of adaptation and an executive process involved in selective attention, self-regulation, and consciousness. So strong inhibitory control indicates a better ability to suppress goal irrelevant or competing information during a task. This leads us to assume that maybe strong inhibitory ability is beneficial in most of cases. If we think of the process of L2 learning, the task irrelevant and less important information is L1. And for successful L2 learning, L1 interferences should be minimized during L2 use. So we may hypothesize that strong inhibitory control is helpful in L2 learning since it reduces the L1 influences. The question regarding the benefits of strong inhibitory control to L2 learning can be as follows. Do learners with higher inhibitory control have an advantage while learning L2? Darcy et al. In 2016 examined this question. Their goal was to study the relationship between the strength of L2 learners' inhibitory control and their accuracy in perceiving and producing L2 segments. The results were that L2 learners with higher inhibition scores demonstrated lower error rate in a speeded ABX L2 categorization task. Thus, the authors suggested that learners with higher inhibitory control may have used this ability in the process of learning, leading more accurate L2 phonological representations. However, it was not always the case that strong inhibitory control was beneficial in L2 learning. Other studies shows no relationship between inhibitory control and L2 learning. Therefore, it seems that there are inconsistent results about the relationship between inhibitory control and L2 learning. In addition, we still do not have much knowledge on how individual differences in inhibitory control appears in the course of L2 learning. For example, Darcy et al.'s study tested L2 learners' performances only one time. So it is not clear whether strong inhibitor control actually worked beneficially while learners learned L2 in the past. Therefore, the current study tries to explore these 2 points and extend previous studies. We conducted a L2 training experiment in this study. It was a 3-day training. Also, we kept track of learners' performances during the training sessions. This means that learners were tested multiple times, not just one time. So, the major question of our study is that in this training case, will we observe the benefits of strong inhibitor control shown in Darcy et al.'s 2016 study? From now on, I will explain the method of our training study. The target second language in the study was Korean, and learners' first language was English. English voicing contrast in stop consonants are signaled by VOT, which is a primary cue, and F0 at the vowel onset, which is a secondary cue. Korean has three-way stop contrast, which also use VOT and F0 at vowel onset as cues. However, compared to the English contrast, the relative significance of those cues are reversed in Korean. For perceiving shortest stop, shortest VOT and mid to high F0 are used. The confusing consonants are Lenis and aspirated stops. They show a great deal of VOT overlaps. Therefore, F0 is used as a primary cue for Korean Lenis and aspirated stops. F0 of aspirated stops are higher than F0 of Lenis stops. This difference between English and Korean may require native English speakers' modification of their native curating strategies. In other words, they may need to use F0 cues more actively during Korean learning than they do in the perception of English stops. We chose Korean three-way bilabel stop contrast as a target non-native contrast. Training stimuli were pseudosynthetic Sevis levels, which constructed a continuum of Korean pa, and pa. To test learners' use of F0 and VOT cues in learning, stimuli were varied in VOT and F0 values. To create training stimuli, first, 4 native female Korean speakers produced a baseline token pa, and then the baseline tokens were resynthesized varying in 7 VOT steps and 5 F0 steps. Therefore, total 35 stimuli were created per speaker. Total 14 native speakers of English participated in this study. They did not have any prior experience of Korean language learning. We chose 3 days of computer-based high phonetic variability training with multiple Tokers as a training paradigm. Since our participants were naive learners, each training stimulus was associated with a photograph. Total 3 training sessions were in the form of 3 alternative forced choice tests. When a training sound was played, learners had to choose one of 3 pictures appeared on the computer screen. Trial by trial feedback was given. Each training session was ended with an everyday identification test. This test was same as training phase, but feedback was not given. For each everyday ID test, individual learners' choices and percentage correct were collected for analysis. Learners' inhibitory control was measured by retrieval-induced inhibition task, which was used in Darcy et al.'s study. The RI task consists of 3 steps. In step 1, participants were presented with 6 words of 3 different categories and asked to memorize them. Each word with a matched category appeared on the screen for 5 seconds. In step 2, participants were shown again half of items from 2 categories, and they were asked to type words on the computer keyboard multiple times as a practice. This practice phase increased the level of activation of the practiced items, and inhibition was expected to occur on the unpracticed items in 2 practiced categories. By contrast, the items from the unpracticed category were not inhibited and served as control items. In the test step, participants were shown all words from step 1 again, as well as filler words, and they were asked to decide as quickly as possible whether they had seen those words during the step 1. Reaction time for each decision was collected. Following the equation on the screen, inhibition score for each learner was calculated. Learners with strong inhibitory control were expected to take longer reaction time to reactivate unpracticed items from practice category during the test step. This is because the unpracticed item from practice category might be well inhibited during the practice step. Therefore, inhibition scores higher than 1 indicate strong inhibitory ability. Here is the result of the effect of inhibition scores on everyday ID test scores. The x-axis on the graph are inhibition scores, and higher inhibition scores indicate strong inhibition ability. And y-axis represent percentage correct of everyday ID test scores. As shown in the first graph, day 2 scores, which is in blue color, are higher than day 1 score in red, as inhibition scores became lower. The same result was observed for day 3 scores in green color as well. Learners with low inhibition scores improved more than learners with high inhibition scores on day 3 compared to day 1. Surprisingly, these results showed that greater improvements during the training were associated with less inhibitory control. We also divided learners into 2 different groups, which are high inhibition and low inhibition groups, based on their inhibition scores. On the graph, blue represents high inhibition group and yellow represents low inhibition group. We could find a trend of an interaction effect between group and everyday ID test scores of day 2. Along with the individual result in the previous slide, this group result also suggests that low inhibition group outperformed the high inhibition group on day 2. The possible reason of this contradictory result to Dorsey et al.'s study will be discussed at the end of the presentation. So far, we have seen that learners with reduced inhibitory control performed better during the Korean training. At this point, we wondered why reduced inhibitory control learners showed better performances during the training. We speculate that they might use the critical acoustic cue, which is F0 in the study, better than learners with high inhibitory control during the training. So, we performed other analysis to investigate how individual differences in inhibitory control affect learners' use of F0 cue to distinguish Korean stops, especially Korean Lenis and aspirated stops. The proportion of aspirated responses across everyday ID tests for each of VOT and F0 steps was collected. As a reminder, F0 of Korean aspirated stops are higher than F0 of Lenis stops. So, Korean listeners perceive more aspirated stops as F0 steps of stimuli increase. This slide discusses the effect of inhibition scores on the use of F0 cue in the perception of Korean stops. The x-axis of graph is inhibition score, and the y-axis is proportion of aspirated responses. The red line represents F0 step 1, which is the lowest F0 value, and the blue line represents F0 step 5, which is the highest F0 value. The bigger the gap between the blue and red line is, the more the F0 cue was used to discriminate Korean aspirated stops from Korean Lenis stops. As shown in the graph, the gap was bigger as the inhibition scores became lower. This result indicates that learners with low inhibition scores showed more use of F0 cue in the perception of Korean stops. Following the individual result, the slide discusses the group result. This graph is showing the proportion of aspirated responses according to the 5 F0 steps. Both groups showed aspirated responses as F0 steps increased. However, the low inhibition group showed higher effective F0. These heat map plots help us to understand how differently learners weighted VOT and F0 cues compared to native Korean listeners. The proportion of aspirated responses are shown for each combination of VOT and F0 step. Closer to the black color indicates more aspirated responses. The top graph is showing the perception of native Korean listeners. We can see that for stimuli with relatively high VOT steps, native Korean listeners identified stimuli with higher F0 steps as aspirated stimuli. Two graphs on the bottom show the results of high and low inhibition groups. Compared to the high inhibition group, the graph for the low inhibition group shows more color closer to black for stimuli with high F0 and mid to long VOT. More clear difference can be observed by individual results. The graph on the left side is from a learner with the highest inhibition score, and the right side graph is from a learner with the lowest inhibition score. We can see the clear difference regarding the use of F0Q by these learners. Compared to the learners with high inhibition score, the learner with low inhibition scores relied more on the F0Q for perceiving Korean letters and aspirated stop contrast. And this learner showed the pattern which was closer to Korean native listeners' pattern. Overall, the result of the current study suggests that reduced inhibitor control was more beneficial. In summary, learners with reduced inhibitor control showed higher improvements in L2 Korean stop contrast learning and more use of zero cues to distinguish Korean aspirated stops from Korean language stops, and more native-like cue weighting patterns for identifying target Korean contrast. Then, why reduced inhibitor control was more advantageous in L2 learning context of our study? We speculate that the possible reason can be found in the stage of L2 learning. In our study, the learners were naive learners without any knowledge in Korean. Therefore, they were at the initial stage of learning. In this stage, learners might not be sure of how to weight VOT and F0 cues in favor of target language. There are two possibilities that learners might show during the initial phase of L2 learning, depending on their inhibitor control. Reduced inhibitor control involves less suppression of multiple acoustic cues. This indicates that learners with reduced inhibition might have broader focus of attention to multiple acoustic cues rather than suppressing them. During the initial stage of learning, learners' broader focus of attention might allow them to notice the existence of multiple available acoustic cues in L2. And consequently, learners may be able to find out and learn the relative importance of those cues in L2. However, learners with strong inhibitor control may not get this advantage. At the initial stage of learning, naive learners' strong inhibitor control actively suppresses the less relevant acoustic cue in L1, which is F0 in the study. This means that learners' attention can be exclusively on VOT. So, their strong attention to VOT might hinder learners from paying a broader focus of attention and realizing the availability of our other acoustic cues during L2 learning. Therefore, we preliminarily argue that reduced inhibitor control is beneficial in initial stage of L2 learning. Noticing available and possibly relevant acoustic cues should be preceded before selecting which cues to suppress for native-like perception. However, Darcy et al.'s study suggested the benefits of strong inhibitor control in L2 learning. The learners in Darcy's study were at more later stage of L2 learning compared to the current study. At a later stage of L2 learning, strong inhibitor control may be more helpful since learners possibly already found the relative acoustic cues in the past. Therefore, the ability to suppress less relevant cues in L2 would result more favorably in learning L2 categories. Similar to our study, Kim et al. In 2020 also argued that low inhibitor control may lead to a broader focus of attention and an ability to process more acoustic cues. In their study, they conducted a phonetic adaptation task, which required listeners to learn less relevant information to adapt unfamiliar speech patterns. In unfamiliar speech, the relative importance of acoustic cues was reversed. Results showed that listeners with reduced inhibitor control showed better adaptation by upweighting the reliance on the secondary cue. Even though Kim et al.'s study was not about alter-learning, both Kim et al. And our studies show that listeners with low inhibitor control could utilize the less relevant acoustic cue better when they were required to do so. In conclusion, our study suggests 2 points. First, reduced inhibitor control can be beneficial in certain learning contexts. And second, learners' inhibitor control may act differently depending on the stage of alter learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiyoon. So we will now open the floor to questions. So Silky Park says it was a great talk.
Thank you.
So you could either use the raise your hand function or type your question into the Q&A box or into the chat box. Okay, so we have a question from Guwan Lee. Thank you for your presentation. In slide 26, the high inhibitory control participant seems to use F0 as a cue that signifies the aspirated consonant when VLT is low to intermediate, while using VLT if VLT is high enough. How could this be related to the right inhibitory control? Couldn't this mean they can hold more cues in mind?
Okay, so yes, thank you for your question. So high inhibitor control participants seems to use observed cues as, so you were asking, so yes, high inhibitor control learners also use F0 cues because while they were receiving the training, they could receive the active feedback about their performances. So at the end of the training or in the middle of the training, they started realizing the importance of F0 cue. But we think that because of their exclusive focus on VOTQs in the initial stage of their learning, they may have hard time to change their focus to F0 Q, which is more relevant and more important Q in Korean L2 learning. But yes, we could see definitely that high inhibition learners also used F0 Qs, but I guess because our training was pretty short, I guess that's why we couldn't see the very clear use of F0 Q by high inhibition learner compared to low inhibition group learner.
Okay, so now I see that Laura Catherine Smith has her hand raised, so I'm going to unmute her. Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. So I had 2 questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was actually how you would see this as being able to be implemented into a second language classroom, especially considering the fact that we have so many people who are teaching foreign languages without linguistics training, unfortunately. And the second thing is if there is a way, I know some work that I've done with a colleague on kind of subsequent cues that are showing up in different dialects, that we found that that has had a huge advantage. But I guess how do you also then see the perception and the production then going hand in hand?
Oh, you mean by L2 learners?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thanks for your questions. So for your first question about the classroom application, um, we actually try to give our learners some different types of training based on their inhibitory control. So for the learners who have high inhibitory control, we think that they may have hard time to understand the importance of F0Q, right? So we try to give them some special phase of training that focus only on F0Q and then make them realize the importance of F0Q before they actually start the um, real L2 training phase. However, for learners with low inhibitor control, it seems that they do not get much advantage about the extra time of training for making them focusing on to F0Q. So I guess that type of training can be especially helpful for learners who have high inhibition control. And for your second question about the perception and production, we haven't tested our learners' production after the training. However, we think that maybe low inhibition learners also have better production pattern than high inhibition group learners because they since they already realize the importance of F0Q, maybe they can utilize that while they are producing the target Korean contrast. And about your dialect suggestion is very interesting because actually in Korean, we have a dialect which uses some other cues than standard Korean dialect. And then some scholars said that they all actually have an advantage in learning some second language contrast. So I guess we can definitely look into that and then apply that to our study with some dialect variabilities. Thank you.
Okay, next I see we have a question from Lynn Santelman, who asks, if the effects of inhibitory control change with change proficiency, what level of proficiency is needed to have inhibitory control beneficial? What would cause a switch? Would working memory be a better predictor of later ability to attend to multiple cues?
Oh, yes, thank you for your question, Lynn. It's very interesting points. And then actually we have thought of that. So since our learners were very naive learners, so they did not have any exposure to Korean. So I guess they had some advantage from their low inhibitor control when they were started the L2 phase. However, I guess for the later stage of learners, they may get their advantage from high inhibitor control because once they notice the importance of certain cues, maybe they have better ability to suppress the irrelevant cues in L2 and then just focus on the relevant cue while they're learning the target language. So I guess it changes depending on the learner's proficiency. So sometimes benefits of low inhibitor control can be cannot it can be not beneficial for learners who have higher proficiency. Um, and also about the working memory. So working memory is a better predictor for almost everything. So we think that that may be a disadvantage for our study. And also we think that working memory would be more helpful for higher proficient learner, because working memory is also related to how learners can keep their memory or useful memory for a long in a long-term period, right? So we think that that would be more helpful for later stage of learners, but we can also check a working memory of naive learners and then the benefits of them. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like that is all the time we have for this particular talk. So now it's time to move on to our next presentation, which is going to be by Meg Seakosh and from the University of Maryland. And the talk of, I'm sorry, the title of the talk is Language Exposure Predicts Bilingual Children's Speech Patterns.
Great, thank you. Just give me one sec to get the slides set up. Okay, hopefully you can see slides but no notes. That's the ideal situation, at least. All right, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Meg Seakosh, and today I'll be talking about how language exposure predicts bilingual children's speech patterns. So different bilingual children, they grow up in different home language environments. So they differ with respect to how much they are exposed to each of their two languages. So some children in a given bilingual community, they may be exposed to and use more of one of their languages, let's say French, while other children in that bilingual community might be exposed to and use more of their other language, let's say English, even though all of the children in this community will of course become fluent users of both of their languages. And these differences in the home bilingual language environment, they affect children's speech language development. So early in development, bilingual children show dominance effects for the language that they're exposed to more. They have larger vocabularies in that language. They have more mature babbling shapes in that language. They process speech differently in that language. And the result of that is that even within the same speech community, with children of the same age, learning the same languages, we get this gradient of bilingual language experience. And so we think that language exposure affects children's speech language outcomes like speech processing, but how can we experimentally determine the extent of the role of the environment for speech outcomes? We could follow children longitudinally, but of course that's quite difficult to do. We could just withhold language input from one group, but that is quite unethical. Or we could do what we're going to talk about today, and that's to look at children who just naturally differ in their environmental and language experience, and specifically bilingual children. So the bilingual population studied here are bilingual Quechua Spanish children from communities undergoing language shift in Bolivia. These data were collected in the southern Bolivian highlands over the course of 3 summers. Data collection was facilitated by a local partnership with a primary school and the snowball method to meet local caregivers. And 2 types of data were collected that I'll be talking about today: day-long audio recordings and controlled data like word repetition tasks. So in these communities, children receive input at home in the parent's minority language, which the children learn to speak, but the children express themselves at school or with their peers in the majority language. So children's language experience, it depends upon a number of factors, including language use at home and maybe the presence of parents or grandparents who speak Quechua. And the result is that some children are more dominant in Quechua and others dominate more in Spanish during language development. And this varies as a consequence of the environment that the child is raised in. So before jumping into the methods, I'm going to briefly talk about the children's speech language outcomes that we'll be discussing today. So language structure is reflected in speech. So for example, your fundamental frequency drops and your vowels reduce at prosodic boundaries like the end of sentences. But more specifically, word structure is reflected in speech. So for example, take two homophones, like the verb side and the noun side, and the verb side is reliably longer in duration than the noun side in adult speech. And similarly, take the biphone sequence, this stop fricative sequence, in a morphologically simple word like box and a complex word like rocks. And it turns out that adults and children, they co-articulate more in between the segments in the sound sequence in the simple word like box and the complex word like rocks. And this ability to distinguish between words like box and rocks indicates that speakers are able to parse morphologically complex words into their separate morphemes, like rock and the plural morpheme, versus words like box that only have one morpheme. So it's interesting to observe these differences in adults and children's speech, but this research, it leaves us with an outstanding question, and that's, how do children acquire these phonetic differences between morphologically complex and simple words like rocks and box? And how does language use and experience predict children's speech patterns by word location? And so to answer this, we're going to study bilingual children, specifically bilingual children with different language experiences in their ambient environments due to this ongoing shift in their speech communities. The first type of data collected that I'll be discussing today are the day-long audio recordings. So these recordings were used to estimate each child's language exposure and use, that is their language dominance. And the participants were 35 bilingual Quechua Spanish children aged 5 through 8 with approximately the same number of children of each age. And the participants were part of a larger corpus of about 100 bilingual children and infants. Each child completed one day-long recording where they wore a small audio recorder over the course of an entire day. And the recordings were on average about 12 hours long. The recorder wasn't worn to school for ethics reasons, but all children went to school for the same number of hours per day, and the schools are uniformly conducted in Spanish, and children really only speak Spanish there. So the workflow to process the recordings was as follows. So each family would complete at least one recording, usually more, and then these recordings would get chopped into little 30-second clips, and then those 30-second clips would be randomly selected from the overall recording, and then they would be annotated. They'd be annotated for language, so they could be a Quechua clip, a Spanish clip, or mixed, and they'd be annotated for speaker. So that would be the target child, another child, an adult female or an adult male, or any combination of that. So an obvious drawback of these day-long recordings is the time required to annotate them, right? And so to kind of circumvent that issue, I employed random sampling from the recording, where random 30-second clips were drawn from the recording and then annotated. And usually samples from these long format recordings are consciously sampled, for example, from the morning and the afternoon and the night. But by using random sampling, we can actually more efficiently reach an equilibrium between the language categories. So, for example, the annotation of clips from the recording would stop when the ratio between language categories asymptoted, as you can see here in this graph, which plots the number of clips annotated and then the ratio between the categories on the y-axis. And for the first 20 clips, there's a lot of volatility between the language categories, and this slowly evens out as more and more clips are annotated. So the ratio between categories in each recording asymptoted after on average about 185 30-second clips, or after about just 1.5 hours from the recording, which is a pretty efficient way to naturalistically estimate children's dual language environments. So now I'll discuss the methods to elicit the words to measure those morphophonetic patterns. So a word elicitation task was designed to elicit the two types of words that we're interested in studying here. So we need both an across morpheme word location and a within morpheme word location. And so the task would go like this. The child would be presented a photo of a high frequency noun in the task book. And simultaneously, they would hear the model speaker say the word in Quechua, and here the word is hualpa, or chicken. And then the child would repeat the word, and then the experimenter would prompt the child to produce an inflected noun by asking, "Where is my bug?" and placing a big plastic bug on top of the photo of the target item. And then the child would respond with an inflected noun, like with the locative marker. So it is on top of the chicken, for example. So this task generates two types of words. We're going to get bare nouns like chicken or lightning, and we're going to get inflected nouns with a morpheme, either the locative morpheme P or the allative morpheme mung. So two different morphemes were elicited, the locative and the allative, but the results are pretty consistent for both, so I'm not going to be distinguishing between them much for the rest of the talk. These two word types, they created two word locations, an across morpheme location and a within morpheme location. So to measure how the children are distinguishing between the two word locations, we measure the co-articulation between phones in the across morpheme location and the co-articulation between phones in the within morpheme location. And then we take the difference between the co-articulation measure in the across morpheme environment and the within morpheme environment, and we get the difference between word locations, or how much the child is distinguishing between simple and morphologically complex words in their speech. So to recap, we're measuring bilingual children's Quechua Spanish use and exposure using day-long audio recordings. And then we're measuring how these children distinguish between word locations in morphologically simple and complex words in their speech. And we think that children who are exposed to and use more Spanish, that they're going to distinguish less between Quechua word locations in their speech. So let's get to some results. Here we'll look at the relationship between expressive language experience and how the child differentiates between word locations. So on the x-axis, we're plotting the percentage of total monolingual Spanish clips with the target child, and on the y-axis, we're plotting the difference between word locations. So a lower value on the y-axis is going to indicate that the child distinguishes between the word locations a bit less. The colors on these plots represent the two morphemes that were collected, the locative and the allative, and as you can see, the results are pretty consistent for both. And overall, what we can take away from this plot is that children who use more Spanish in their recordings, they tend to distinguish less between the word locations. We can quantify experience in a different way. The only difference on this plot is that now we're plotting the percentage of monolingual Quechua clips where the child was speaking, and we see a reverse effect. So children with more monolingual Quechua clips, they tend to differentiate by word location a bit more. So the children's own language use appears to correlate with how they distinguish between the word locations, but here I visualize a different parameter, and that's for receptive language. This is the mother's bilingual language profile. So we're plotting the bilingual language profile on the x-axis, and here we have monolingual mothers in red, Quechua dominant mothers in green, and bilingual Quechua Spanish mothers in blue. It's the same outcome variable. This is how much the child distinguishes between the word locations. And we can see that there really doesn't seem to be an effect of the maternal bilingual language profile on the children's, how much they distinguish between the categories. So we've got some models to test for these differences. Our outcome variable is the co-articulation differences between word locations, and a number of parameters representing expressive and receptive language experience were then added to the model predicting the difference between word locations. So first we add percentage of child Spanish clips. This represents the target child's language use, what percentage of the clips in their recording where the child was speaking were monolingual Spanish. Percentage of adult Spanish was similar, what percentage of monolingual Spanish clips where an adult was speaking were present, and then maternal language dominance. And that's going to estimate the mother's language dominance, whether she was monolingual Quechua dominant or bilingual Quechua Spanish. And the best model fit included the percentage of child Spanish, indicating that it was the expressive language parameter, that is the child's actual language use, that was the best predictor of the child's ability to distinguish between word locations, independent of child age, right? Note that we controlled for that. Okay, so let's discuss some of the results. So to recap, in this study, a unique bilingual setting was studied. This is a community undergoing language shift and the ensuing variability in the children's language experiences that renders. And we used that to evaluate children's co-articulation patterns by morphological location. And we saw that children who had more experience with Quechua, specifically those who used more Quechua in their recordings, they distinguished a bit more between morphological locations, while children who used more Spanish in their recordings, they distinguished a bit less between the morphological locations. We also saw that children's language use was a better predictor than parents' dominance or use. And overall, this is evidence from speech production that the more Quechua children use, the more they analyze morphologically complex words. And these effects, they really suggest that there are bilingual dominance effects on children's speech and language, in addition to some of those areas that I talked about at the beginning, like babbling and vocabulary and speech processing. The stronger predictor of child language use, that hasn't been the case for all the phonetic outcomes that I've studied in this project. So in other work, I actually showed that it is the mother's language dominance, that bilingual language profile I discussed, and not children's language use, that's the best predictor of children's vowel variability. So children with monolingual Quechua moms have tighter, less variable Quechua vowel categories than children with more Quechua dominant moms and bilingual Quechua Spanish moms. It's possible that the stronger effect of children's language use on their morphology phonetic outcomes indicates that something more than language dominance is influencing the patterning. It could be that this lack of distinguishing between locations indicates that some children represent these words differently. So in other words, if it really were as simple as language dominance, then why should the children's language dominance be such a much stronger predictor of their ability to distinguish between locations than the primary caretaker's language dominance, since those categories are obviously correlated? These results also have some implications for morphological parsing and change in language change. The results suggest that there is a graded reanalysis of morphologically complex words. And so you could ask, could this ignite morphological change? So first, let's remember that language shift does not always occur in a single generation, where adults speak a minority language and then children switch entirely to the majority language. And here's how this could unfold. So some children use more Spanish than their parents. Those children start to analyze morphologically complex Quechua words differently. Maybe with more experience, these children differentiate between word locations in Quechua, just like more monolingual Quechua speakers do. But if not, how will that affect the language input that these Spanish dominant children provide their own children someday? I'm gonna wait for the siren to pass my apartment, sorry. Will their speech provide acoustic cues to morphological boundaries in Quechua? Or will the lack of cues to these morpheme boundaries in their speech, will that lead to further generations not distinguishing necessarily between morphologically simple and morphologically complex Quechua words? And this would mean that this morphological reanalysis had stemmed from language acquisition and bilingualism in the community. So I want to thank a research team, a group of undergraduate RAs at Berkeley who helped me process and manage and annotate all the day-long recordings. It was a really big undertaking and I'm very grateful for their assistance. And then I also want to acknowledge funding, of course, but also my dissertation committee. This was work for my dissertation. So Keith Johnson, Sharon Inglis, and Mahesh Srinivasan, and a couple of other individuals who gave really good insight to a project that was several years in the making. So thank you. I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Meg. So we are now opening the floor to questions. So interesting, Laura Smith says. Oh, yes, we have a question from Amalia Skilton. Thank you for a great talk. Considering the unexpected findings about the role of maternal language dominance, did you consider other measures of the language makeup of children's input? Which ones?
Yeah, so that's a good question because that was surprising. Like I said, it's kind of assumed that the children's language dominance should probably correlate with their parents' dominance. So we looked at input in a couple different ways. Obviously, these are pretty coarse measures, right? So we're just looking at the two ways that we looked at it in the model were looking at the proportion of the language categories as derived from the recordings themselves, so like a more naturalistic measure, and then also the kind of like more coarse bilingual language profile measure, which was based off of an interview with the caregiver. And so there are additional ways that we could get a little bit more fine-grained, especially going into the day-long recordings and seeing like perhaps if looking at like the richness of the interactions, like the number of turns in Quechua with the caregiver and seeing if that is a stronger predictor than the child's own language use. So something that's like a little bit more interactive than just simple input. I think that that would probably be a good place to go. I think maybe the lack of effect here is partially because the input measures were a bit coarse.
Okay, and now we have a question from Guan Li. I wonder how children participated in this research could have differently parsed morphologically complex words since they properly used locative, etc. morphemes to depict the photos.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that a really important takeaway from this is to point out that all of these children are fluent Quechua Spanish speakers. They are all morphologically productive. There's the fact alone that they completed the task demonstrates that they are morphologically productive. So I'm not trying to make the argument that they're not. I think it's just we're looking a little bit more fine-grained at like some of the really fine-grained differences in their speech. I don't try to make a really strong argument about what that means for their lexical representations. I think that requires probably a little bit more fine-grained speech processing work, but we're just looking at more fine-grained stuff in their speech production, but definitely not trying to say that it's evidence of lack of morphological productivity or anything.
Okay, now I see Laura Catherine Smith has some questions. Did you take a look at the use of language with friends in particular? And did you have multiple children in a single family? Did you see differences in the children's speech?
Yeah, those are both really, really good questions. I'll start with the friend question first. I didn't dig deep into the recordings yet to look at particular interactions with friends, but I can say anecdotally, having listened to a lot of the recordings to do the annotation work, that Quechua is much less common amongst when children are speaking with their own peers. They become accustomed to using Spanish with their peers because that's the language that's used at school. And so then they go home and after the school day is done and they don't necessarily switch back to Quechua just because they're at home with their peers, right? They keep using Spanish and then they use Quechua with their parents. So I think that there would be really interesting things to look at with their language practices with friends, but their use probably would dominate, Spanish would dominate their use with friends. And then there are several siblings in the overall corpus. This was a limited age range. They were just 5 to 8 year olds. So I think there are maybe 2 groups of siblings, if I remember correctly, like a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, for example. I haven't specifically looked at sibling dynamics, although we have an analysis that we're doing right now with my work with Anale Villanueva and Adriana Weissletter at Northwestern, where we're looking at how sibling input affects language change. So we're looking at it in a corpus that they have, which is on Spanish, English use amongst immigrant communities in the United States. And we're also looking at it in the corpus, the Bolivian corpus, to see the impact of sibling input on infants' exposure to dual language exposure. So stay tuned for that maybe in the next 6 to 9 months.
Okay, next we have a question from Ariana Banku. she asks, did you use the bilingual language profile questionnaire to assess language dominance? If the answer is yes, follow-up would be, are Spanish and Quechua comparable when it comes to literacy in each language in terms of how much access people have to literacy in each language?
So I will say I didn't mean to use the term bilingual language profile in terms of the one that Mark and the birdsong one. That's not the profile that I used. It wasn't really appropriate for this cultural context. So I wrote my own language use questionnaire. And so the question about literacy, there is a robust writing system in Quechua. It's not super frequently used by speakers. So that is to say that speakers of Quechua, they grow up speaking Quechua at home, they go to school, they learn to read and write in Spanish. And then it's not that there is a complete absence of Quechua at school. You can see it in textbooks, for example. I don't mean to say that it doesn't have a presence, but it's difficult to get access to a lot of literary materials in Quechua. That is absolutely the case. And so it is the case that I would say most bilingual Quechua Spanish speakers, not all, but most bilingual Quechua Spanish speakers would only be, if they're literate in a language, they're literate in Spanish and not Quechua.
Okay, next we have some questions from Lynn Santelman, who asks 2 questions. How much input in Quechua did the children get from adults other than their mothers? Did you test their production of Spanish morphologically complex words as well, or was the focus on Quechua?
I'll answer the question about the Spanish first. We didn't test anything about morphologically complex Spanish words, but I do have some non-word repetition data from these same children that's being analyzed right now. So where they repeated nonce words that were phonetically licit in Quechua and non-words that were licit in Spanish. So there are some phonological outcomes for both Spanish and Quechua, but the morphological extension task was only for Quechua. And then, sorry, I don't know where this question is asked. What was the first part of the question?
Oh, let's see, okay.
Oh, how much input did the kids get from people other than their mothers? A lot. They get lots and lots of input from lots of diverse speakers. Of course, fathers have a significant role, but there's a large presence of older siblings, people coming to the house. The mothers might spend time, walking to the market, or when they're at the market, there's going to be a lot of older women around, like of their mother's age. So they get lots of pretty diverse input. And again, we're in the process of quantifying exactly the diversity of the language models that these children get, how it varies between children, and then how it varies from a bilingual community in the US.
Okay, now we have a question from Yuka Tatsumi in the chat box. Yuka says, this may be a little redundant, but could you talk a little bit about the participants' school education background? Classes are taught in Spanish, but do they also get education in Quechua language itself? If so, do you know how many years? Would their explicit knowledge of Quechua be influencing their perception of morphemes?
Yeah, I can get into a little bit more detail about the Quechua education opportunities. So the extent in these communities in Bolivia, this is not uniform. I don't mean to speak for all schools in Bolivia, but the schools that these children go to, I work at one of the schools, so I know what the learning materials look like. Sometimes there will be like individual Quechua words in a textbook, if it was like a science or language arts notebook or something. like a primer. There might be like some basic like Quechua vocabulary words, but that's pretty much the extent of it. There isn't like any like a specific Quechua grammar taught or anything, at least at these schools that these children are attending. So really the opportunity to have a meta-linguistic awareness of Quechua is pretty limited. That being said, I actually think that there could be an influence of morphological awareness in Spanish that would have an effect on the task. And that's for a couple of reasons. The morphological system of Quechua and Spanish they're distinct. Quechua is agglutinating and Spanish is fusional, but it's still, you know, I mean, you're adding suffixes to a root. So in that sense, you know, I think that it's definitely possible that morphological awareness in one language would influence the other. And actually, I think it's more likely that phonological awareness in Spanish, which comes about through literacy primarily, would have a role in morphological analysis in Quechua. So I get, especially given the overlap in the phonological system between Quechua and Spanish. Again, there are differences. Of course, Quechua has adjectives, Spanish does not, for example. Spanish has 5 phonemic vowels, Quechua has 3. But there are a lot of overlaps in the phonotactics and the phonology. So I think that phonological awareness in particular in Spanish, which is acquired through literacy, would probably have some effect on these results.
Okay, and that is all the time we have for Q&A.
Thank you.
Meg. So our next talk is going to be by Wei Cheng Wang and Sung Im Lee Kim from National Jiaodong University. And the title of their talk is entitled Loss of Final Stop Place Contrasts Among Young Mandarin Min Bilingual Speakers in Taiwan. So Sung Im, you can go ahead and get started. This is a pre-recorded talk, right?
Yes, thanks for coming to the talk. We're joining from Taiwan. It's actually right now 4 a.m. So I'm not that clear. So please allow me to share the pre-recorded slides, but I'll be here to answer your questions at the Q&A. One thing to note, let's see. Chris does it work? Can you see?
Yeah.
Chris would very much wanted to join the talk, but he had to serve for the country, so I'll be here alone today. Let me play. There we go.
Bilingual speakers often fail to successfully acquire marked sounds in the target language. A well-known example of this is th stopping, like den for thin, den for then. In this case, interdental fricatives are replaced with the corresponding stop sounds, as in Cajun English. These sounds are marked in a sense that they have weak perceptual cues, and they are typologically aware. This pattern is commonly found for many other immigrant populations in the US and has been reported extensively in the literature. Another example is unreleased final stops. They have weak phonetic cues to place contrast because of the lack of stop burst. We know that vowel transitions are the primary cues to the place contrast for the stops, but if you lose the secondary cue entirely, then the perception of the contrast would be diminished. These weak perceptual cues have led to some consequences in historical sound change. So they have been unstable diachronically. And here are some examples from the Chinese languages. So the Southern Chinese, including Yue, Kejia, and Min, they retain pataka endings in the system, whereas if you look at the corresponding cognate words spoken in the north, like Standard Mandarin, they don't keep it there. So the Mandarin, as you might know, they don't allow for pataka endings as well as the labial nasal sounds in the system. Even among the Southern Chinese languages, some of them has gone through the sound change further. So for example, Chaoshan Min has gone through ta to ka merger. So they only have pa and ka and glottal stop in the system. And another outside the Chinese language, this is Atayal, one of the Australian languages, and they have gone through pa to ka merger, so they only have ta, ka, and glottal stop in the system. So the goal of this study is to provide a synchronic evidence for how imperfect learning of marked features may derive a potential loss of phonological contrast by bilingual speakers of languages in contact. So we wanted to focus on the acquisition of unreleased final stop place contrast by Mandarin mean bilingual speakers in Taiwan. To give you some background of the linguistic situation in Taiwan, Taiwan Mandarin is an official and dominant language spoken all over the island. So especially for the younger generation, Taiwan Mandarin is their first language. They're most comfortable with this language and they're most fluent at this language, no matter what they use at home with their grandparents. Taiwan Mandarin is a variety of Standard Mandarin. So just like Standard Mandarin, they don't allow for final stops. So pa, ta, ka endings are phonotechnically illegal. Another majority language spoken in Taiwan is Taiwanese Southern Mean, TSM. The map on the left is plotting most commonly used home languages. Blue represents Taiwan Mandarin and green represents TSM. And just so you know, the east coast of Taiwan is not densely populated, so there are not many people living in there. So basically the country is divided into two, north and south, in different colors and different languages. So mostly Taiwan Mandarin in the north and Taiwanese Southern Mean in the south. As you can see, Taiwanese Southern Mean is not a minority language. In fact, it was a majority language spoken by about like 70% of the population at the time. But then because of some historical reasons, it was banned from using it in public sectors starting from 1949. So it was demoted as a local and substratum language. Later on, there has been some TSM promotion movement, but still, it's the in terms of linguistic hierarchy, it's not the first language of the country. Because the impact of the language imposition was huge, so the quality and frequency of learning TSM is highly limited for young speakers. And importantly, this language allows for all three place contrasts for the unreleased final stops. And this is the topic of the current study. So the hypothesis is that unreleased final stop place contrast in TSM may be lost because of the imperfect learning of marked features by Mandarin mean bilingual speakers. So we did some experiments to test this hypothesis, and then we'll introduce two of them in this presentation. One is cross-linguistic speech perception of the final stop place contrast, and the other one is a production study where TSM fluent Mandarin mean bilinguals produced final stops. So in the discrimination study, we examined the perceptual accuracy of the stop place contrast by the bilingual listeners. So we invited two groups of young TM speakers. They are all college students. 17 of them were TSM fluent and 21 of them were TSM weak. We did a fairly thorough language background survey where we asked for their self-rated language proficiency scores ranging from 1 to 7, 7 being the most fluent. And as you can see, Mandarin is their first language. They gave highest scores. And then TSM, the two groups show very large differences. And what's interesting about this chart is that they also gave English proficiency scores. And for TSM fluent group, English proficiency is slightly lower than Taiwanese Southern Mean, which is slightly lower than Mandarin. So for them, TSM is somewhere between their first language and their strong second language. And for TSM weak speakers, they put Mandarin first, of course, and then English, and then TSM. So for these TSM weak speakers, they do have some passive knowledge of TSM, but they are very weak at this language. In addition, we also had a control group of 18 Korean listeners. We'll get back to this later, but the Korean speakers are known to have show very good performance with the perception of pataka endings because they do retain all those endings in their native system. Disyllabic pseudo-words in the form of ma something were used as stimuli of this experiment. The pataka endings were at the end of the word, preceded by the two different vowels a and e. So for example, ma sap, ma sat, ma sak. And we had two TSM fluent male speakers producing the stimuli for the experiment. They showed very distinctive transitions for the ik sequence in particular. So when we examined the spectrogram, we could see a clear velar pinch for the Toker 1, showing small after transitions. It sounds like this.
Shik.
It sounds very just common ik sequence, right? And the other Toker showed large falling after transitions, like this, and then not showing velar pinch much. And it sounds like this.
Shik. Shik.
So as you can hear, there seems a small vocoid between e vowel and then k sound. So we added the shua sound to represent that. The reason that we used these two Tokers is because we did a pilot study before the experiments, and we found that many speakers show this large after transitions for the ik sequence. And it would be nice to see how those are perceived by the speakers of TSM. The task was Axb discrimination, where you would hear 3 sounds in a row, and your task is to determine whether the one in the middle is the same with A or B. I'll play some sounds for you.
Ma hak. Ma hak. Ma hak.
The correct answer for this is A. Second one.
Ma ship. Ma shik. Ma shik.
The answer for this is B. As you may have noticed, there are two Tokers, Toker 1 and 2, and then we separated them into two different blocks, Toker 1 first and Toker 2 second, and then we repeated the blocks one more time. Here are the results, plotting mean accuracy in different conditions. I and E vowel are in different columns, Toker 1 and 2 are in different rows, and then different languages are plotted in different colors. The data were analyzed using a mixed effects logistic regression with the following baseline conditions. This bar is marking the baseline conditions where TSM fluent listeners were discriminating T and K for the stimuli produced by Toker 1 in the A vowel context. We found a significant main effects of group, so you can focus on the 3 bars in here. TSM fluent listeners performed worse than Korean listeners, but better than TSM weak listeners. Notice that Korean listeners were performing on the non-native sounds while they performed the best, which suggests that TSM fluent bilinguals have learned the final stops imperfectly. There were other minor patterns found through this analysis, but those are not that important, so I'll skip. In addition to the main effects, we also found a significant 3-way interaction between final, Toker, and vowel. This interaction is a bit complicated, but if we just abstract away from the details, this pattern is driven primarily by the poor performance on the p-t pair, marked in here, for the Toker 2's E context. So if we focus on this corner, Toker 2's E condition, we see that p-t and t-k pair were better discriminated than p-t pair. And this is presumably because of the additional perceptual cues available for the ik sequence produced by this particular Toker. We have seen that this Toker produces some schwa-like vowels in between E and K, and that was helpful for the discrimination of these two pairs. To summarize the findings of the perception study, we found the following orderings between different languages. Korean listeners performed the best, TSM fluent listeners were in the middle, and TSM weak listeners were the last. This particular finding between the two groups of speakers, it suggests unsuccessful transmission between generations, so Mandarin mean bilingual speakers learned the pattern imperfectly. Korean listeners' good performance for the unreleased final stop perception is well known in the literature. So they performed even better than the native English speakers on the perception of English unreleased final stops. And these authors attributed that to the extensive experience with the final stops in their native language. And they used this knowledge, they transferred this knowledge to perform better on the second language stop contrasts. And it's interesting that it's been shown again for the TSM stop perception. We also found another finding in the study. The comparison between TSM fluent and TSM weak listeners shows that stop place contrast were diminished for the TSM fluent bilinguals, but it's not completely lost. Maybe underway, but it's not completely lost yet. Next, we were wondering how these place contrasts are implemented by young Mandarin bilingual speakers. So we did a production study. For the production study, we recruited 21 TSM fluent bilinguals. Half of them participated in the perception study, but the other half was newly recruited for the production. Stimuli were monosyllabic TSM words with final stops. Those TSM words do not appear in isolation, so we provided them with the semantic context so that they can recall what those words were. They were produced in a carrier sentence like this. In addition to the target items, we also added control items that had the exact same phonological materials, just like the target sounds, but without the final stops. So those were open syllables. For the analysis, we did perceptual judgments done by 3 TSM fluent phoneticians, and also we examined the form and transitions on the spectrogram to confirm that the coding was correct. Here are some sample spectrograms. Let me play the sounds for you.
Ship.
Shit. Shik.
She.
The last one is a control item, so it's supposed to be ending with the vowels just like that. As you can see, we can observe characteristic form and transitions for each place of articulation. So falling after transitions for labials, flat after transitions for coronals, and velar pinch for velar sounds, although it's not always the case that we can observe that. Here are the cases where participants deleted the final stops when they're supposed to produce it.
She.
She. He.
As you can hear, it's obvious that the vowels are very long and the stops are deleted in these cases. For the coding, we used both perceptual judgments and format transitions on the spectrogram. About 64% of the data were coded as correct. Our voting criterion was such that more than 2 judges agreed on the perceived finals, which matched the underlying form. And then we confirmed that using the format transition on the spectrogram. About 26% of the items were produced incorrectly. 2 judges agreed on the finals, and those were mismatching with the underlying form. A small portion of the data were not classifiable because all 3 judges have different judgments. And then another small portion was excluded because participants produced just wrong segments, like SWAT for hawk, so they have the wrong representation for their lexical item. Here are the results, plotting the accuracy of the pataka ending words and also the control items ending with the vowel. The results were analyzed using mixed effects logistic regression, using the baseline ak, a, and ka, like in this and the figure. We found the significant main effects of finals. So the words ending with vowels, control items, were produced most accurately, better than pa, followed by ka, which was not significantly different from the ta sound. If you focus on the k sound, we see significant effects of vowels. So the k sound was produced more accurately when it is preceded by e vowel than by a vowel. We found a lack of final vowel interactions, but the p-values are relatively small, which means that the differences between vowel contexts for k was smaller for other consonants. Here is a confusion matrix. If they produced things incorrectly, what did they do? So frequent place confusion was found. So T was oftentimes deleted, especially in the eval context. It was deleted almost like 30% of time. But then also it was produced wrongly as P or K. K was often misproduced as P sound, especially in the A vowel context. And then P sound was better than other sounds. To summarize, we found some place-specific patterns. Labials were produced with the highest accuracy. It's probably because of the salient cues. So labials were consistently produced with the falling form and transitions, and also the visual cues of the lip gesture might help learners to acquire the labials better than other consonants. Chronals were produced with the lowest accuracy. This echoes with the sound change happened in Chaoshan Min, which shows ta to ka merger. Also, it might have to do with the chronal stops being particularly vulnerable to many phonological processes. Dorsals were shown to vary between across vowel contexts. It was produced better in the e vowel context than in the a vowel context. That's probably because the cue enhancing function of this schwa-like vocoid between the e and k sound. And this also echoes with the k sound produced better than other sounds in sound changes. Finally, we looked at correlation between perception and production within an individual speaker. 11 bilingual speakers participated in both production and perception, and there was strong positive correlation between the two, meaning that if you're good at perception, then you're good at production and vice versa. This provides strong evidence for imperfect learning during transmission. Seems that poor perception has led to poor production during acquisition. So TSM final stops were learned imperfectly by the bilingual speakers, but the contrasts were not completely lost yet. But it looks like if anything has to go, then chronal stops are likely to be lost earlier than others. So when we put everything together, the story seems to be like this. So unreleased final stops are marked because of the weak perceptual cues. And if you have insufficient inputs, then you're likely to learn this pattern imperfectly. This poor perception would lead to poor production, which would reinforce each other and derive the loss of stop-place contrast over time. This is all for today's talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sung-Yim. So I see.
It sound okay. It seemed a little small.
I thought it was okay. It was okay on my end. So in the chat box, I see we have a question from Andrew Chung, who asks, what about a palatal off glide from the fricative?
Palatal off glide. I'm not sure what that sound is.
Yeah, okay, so that's not a question so much as wondering about the, okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, we can hear you.
I was just sort of curious about, this doesn't really affect your interpretation of those results, I'm sure, but I've heard of that syllable in words like ship as it not actually being the fricative and then two vowels. You sort of indicated it would be a high front vowel followed by a schwa, but what if it was actually sort of a more centralized vowel and a palatal off glide, and not actually what looked like a diphthong? I know that doesn't really affect the results, but I just thought it was interesting looking at the spectrograms especially. Yeah,
but whatever it was, you know, you hear you may hear it as a diphthong, you may hear it as a schwa or whatever. I think that contributes to the perception of the ka ending word anyway, because the vowel transitions are strong cues to the place. And especially because we did a discrimination study, if you hear diphthongal features, then you can choose the sound better than other consonant contexts, because other consonants, before other consonants, the vowels are monophthongal. There's no big transitions like that. But then when we didn't talk about this in this presentation, we actually did an identification study where people hear the sound and people identify which sound they heard. And even in the identification study where you don't compare sounds between A and B and X, people could identify K better than other pa and ta sounds, which seems that people have, if you speak TSM, then you could have learned, the diphthongal features or off glide or whatever, and then you could use it to identify the sounds better. So for the what's in there between E and K, I actually mentioned in the slide, but didn't talk about it. But it seems like if there is X crescent schwa discussed by Jick and Wilson before. If you have two articulatory targets like E, very fronted tongue body, and then K, backward tongue body, while you're not producing, you don't have the phonological schwa in there, but you're moving from E sound to K from front to the back, then you're kind of passing by this schwa space. That's why you hear something else between E and K. The both sound, the two sounds don't want to give in. I want to keep E, I want to keep K, and then while you're moving from one position to another position, tongue body is passing by somewhere in between, which gives you the schwa perception in there. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Do I have time for another question? Unless there's someone else who has one.
Actually, yeah. I see there's a question from.
Yeah, I'll save mine.
Andrew, you can go. Okay.
Oh. or do you? Okay. So Meg, do you want to go with your question?
I'll go quick and then Andrew can ask his. Yeah, I was just wondering what you thought maybe the cause of the imperfect learning is. So do you think that it's just kind of lack of exposure because you're exposed to two languages, and that doesn't, just because you're learning two languages doesn't mean that like the quantity of your exposure goes up? Or do you think that there's like a lot of variability, since in your model speakers, they had they differed in their transition strategies in that target environment. So do you think that, if you did a random sampling of another 100 speakers, for example, would there be a lot of variability in their transition strategy? So do you think it's like variability in the input? Do you think it's lack of exposure? Like, what do you think is causing the imperfect learning?
I think that both of them could have contributed together. One is the TSM native speakers are mostly the grandparents, the younger generation's grandparents. Their parents don't speak TSM as the first language because of the school, that language imposition. The language was banned from speaking. So the parents wouldn't speak TSM to the children. Now the younger generation that I tested in the experiment. So usually if they speak TSM well, then that means they have lived with their grandparents at home. And then when they're young, they were exposed to TSM because of the co-living with their grandparents. But then you can imagine that, it's, the inputs are highly limited. And another thing that I was talking about is phonological marking, which is arising from the weak phonetic cues to the contrast. You don't have the stop burst in there. Stop burst is not the primary cue for the place contrast for the stops, but still it's providing some information about which place of POA it will be, but then it's completely not there. So if you do the experiments without by removing the stop burst in there, then your perceptual accuracy goes down, definitely. That's another thing. Another thing, the variability, actually, in terms of vowel transitions for the other consonants p and t, they were very stable. It doesn't seem like, you know, there's a huge variability that gives you difficulty in learning the pattern. But then for the K sound, we looked at 10 Mandarin bilingual speakers as a pilot. Those are young speakers. We didn't look at, you know, what, actually, I don't know what older, you know, the grandparents, grandpas do in their production, but for younger speakers, it was kind of half and half. Half the speakers would produce it without the, you know, strong vocoid in between E and K, but the other half would have something like that. So it was half and half, but then when we looked at the correlation between perception and production, those people who retain schwa-like sound between E and K perceived it sounds better and they produced better. So it seems to be definitely like cue enhancing function it has. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so I see that I think we are officially out of time now, but I don't know if the room is going to be left open for like maybe another minute or two. I do see some questions from Lynn Santelman and okay. So the room is going to be open for another minute or two. So if you would like to stay, you are more than welcome to stay. So Lynn asks, is this language change increasing or could it be stable over time? She wonders if there are recordings from 50 years ago that would reveal how variable it is.
I would actually love to see the, you know, older generations production of this, but they are available. They're all like 70s, 80s, but it should definitely be possible to record them. But I'm not there yet. But in terms of language change, because the language imposition and the change has very much to do with the social historical context that Taiwan is. And ever since 2000, there has been like promotion movements and, you know, there has been like TV stations designated for broadcasting everything in Taiwanese Southern Mean. So it's kind of, there is a rise of Taiwanese Southern Mean among the young people, but then and also like at school, you're supposed to learn TSM about 1 or 2 hours every week. But as I hear, it's kind of just lighthearted. You're not that committed. You don't have to be committed to that. But I don't know. But it was a majority language once before, and then a lot of young people are proud of being able to TSM. It was actually kind of shameful thing a long time ago, but now it's not that like that anymore. And then with the rise of this Taiwanese identity, I feel like it's not going to die out. Unlike Taiwan has actually many languages, like 20 minority languages which are dying out very quickly, but I think Taiwanese Southern Mean is spoken by just so many people, and it's also valued by the politicians and so on, so it's probably going to be stable. But then Patoka endings are I don't know, maybe they're you know, like marginal contrast. No? Thank you for the question. Yeah. Thank you for staying with me to the end of the conference.
Okay, and thank you, everyone. That concludes our session today on language acquisition, the role of phonetics. Have a good afternoon, evening, or yeah, whatever is appropriate for your time zone.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.